Hello and welcome to the first episode of Around the World in 80 Teas, the first few stops. My name is Sharon Hall and I'm the Chief Executive of the UKTIA Infusions Association. And today we'll be talking about a tea from China with my co-host Will Battle and our guests Ed Eisler and Ottilie Cunningham. Ed founded Jing Tea in 2004 to provide the most rewarding experience for tea drinkers, whilst also supporting artisan producers and the unique lands they work in. His distinctive single garden teas are enjoyed by tea lovers around the globe and served by many of the world's most acclaimed chefs. Ottilie started out in the tea trade 17 years ago as a trainee at Twinings and subsequently spent a decade working as a global trader before moving into her current role of tea and coffee buyer at the luxury retailer Fortnum & Mason. My co-host Will Battle of Fine Tea Merchants has over 25 years experience in the tea industry and has worked in tea businesses around the world. He is also the author of the World Tea Encyclopaedia. Ottilie, Will and Ed, welcome to the podcast. Today we are talking about tea from China, which is said to be the #1 consumer of tea in the world. Legend has it that the history of tea dates back to ancient China almost 5,000 years ago. And according to one story, Emperor Shennong, a renowned herbalist, was boiling his drinking water when leaves from a nearby tree shrub blew into his cauldron. He tasted the resulting brew and the beverage of tea was born. Will, the birth of tea seems like an excellent place to kick off our discussions on teas from around the world. So I'll hand over to you to start today's conversation.
Yeah, I think all Chinese teas seem to have a good myth behind them. And China produces 45% of the world's tea or thereabouts. Perhaps Dragonwell is its most famous tea. And today we're going to be talking about Dragonwell. So Ed, I wondered if you can give us a sense of where it comes from and what you could expect to see in the areas that are growing and processing Dragonwell tea.
Well, I think for many people, and me included, Dragonwell is maybe the first or most notable tea you entry point you get into in the world of Chinese tea. It's certainly China's most famous tea. And so why is that? I think it's because it combines two, like many great products or things, it combines two things which both contrast and enhance one another. One is the greenness, the freshness aspect. Some people might say it has a grassiness. Some people might say it has a slight seaweediness. It depends a bit on your palate and the style of the production. But that sort of freshness of spring combined with the what many people would describe as a sort of roasted tasting quality. It's actually a fired quality, pan-fired. And that provides a sort of nuttiness, a sweetness, a moorishness. And yeah, with the level of firing or we could say roasting, that's an interesting and important thing for consumers or lovers of Long Jing. At one end of the spectrum, you have the heavily fired, and at the other end, very lightly fired. And people jump to sometimes one extreme or the other. Lion's Peak traditionally was a bit more fired. Major Wu, these are two of the really classic old terroir for Long Jing. Major Wu was more lightly fired. I've personally always liked the more lightly fired one myself, because if you heavily fire it, you kill the greenness in the leaf. You get quite a dead flavor. It's typically done when actually the leaves are not so good and you're trying to kind of modify or even cover up something. So I would tend to prefer medium or lightly fired. But some people like that really, really roasted quality. They sometimes call it a kind of almost a yolky quality, it's sometimes described as well, interestingly. And I think it's just about deciding which you like and going after whichever your preference is, you know. You put those two together and you get something really special, freshness and moorishness. And it's a very delicious drink, which will stay on your palate and stay in your memory for a long time after drinking it and be something that you crave and want to go back to. And it's different to a lot of other green teas, which are just really more of the freshness quality without that sort of fired or slightly roasted quality as well.
So can you perhaps go into how Long Jing will be made to give us a sense of where their nuttiness comes from?
Yeah, I mean, just for context, there are many, many green teas in China. How many? I honestly don't know. I don't know if anyone does. Probably the Tea Research Institute has a figure on it, but let's say it could be as many as it could be 1,000 or more, for sure. And they are going to be different because of the type of tea tree that's used, the cultivar, the origin, and the production style. So it's this relationship between the origin, which is like, let's call it nature, the specific growing conditions, and then the way the tea maker takes it and what they do with the tea after picking. And with Dragonwell particularly, this is a particular style. It's like all green teas, it's picked, it's allowed to wither, and we won't get into too much details, but that basically allows some reactions to happen in the leaf, and it will produce wonderful aromas. The aromas will come out much like spring flowers and other things, and other important things happen to do with the moisture content. And then the leaves will be exposed to heat to kill the enzymes, which retains the greenness. Without the enzymes, there can't be any oxidation. And then with Dragonwell specifically, it is pressed into traditionally a wok with the hand, and that pressing and the shaping of the that's involved makes these kind of spear-shaped flat leaves, very, very flat, and creates this slightly, I'm going to use the word roasted. I think that's the most relatable flavor for those that haven't tasted it. It's kind of roasted flavor. And with Dragonwell, it can be very lightly fired or very heavily fired or somewhere in between. And that will depend on the tea maker and to an extent, the specific place where it's being produced and that cultural style.
It's probably worth adding as well that the difference between a steamed green tea and a pan-fired green tea. The steamed green teas do tend to have much more of a lightness and freshness, whereas the pan-fired have that roasted character that Ed's mentioning. And Long Jing is a very classic pan-fired green tea, and it is that pressing with the heel of the hand into the wok that really brings out the sugars and the caramels in the tea and gives it that roasted sort of, I would say, almost chestnut umami character.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally it's called, traditionally it's always described as chestnut. I don't know if I really relate to that so much. I mean, yeah, I can. But I would say something like roasted hazel is sometimes a nicer description, more relatable perhaps. And I also wanted to say that with Chinese tea, they are Chinese green teas, they are fired. But the degree to which they fire Long Jing and this pressing and shaping is what gives it, one of the things that gives it a very distinctive style. If you take other teas, green teas, for example, from China, like Anji Baicha, that firing element is so light, you don't taste it. And then you've got things in between. So it's a wonderful, the Chinese green tea is something that you can explore in great depth and really get into.
And just for our listeners, I mean, those woks, they're incredibly hot. I've seen it being made, and the producers are doing that with their bare hands. They let me have a go, and they kindly gave me a heat-proof glove. But I mean, it's such an incredible skill to produce this tea, isn't it?
Yeah. So what happens to the hands, Ottilie? Can you have you ever seen one of the artisans making this tea and what their hands look like?
Pretty calloused, a bit like my own, actually, to be honest. Yes.
But further to that, Ottilie, where can you go and see it being made? What part of China are we in here?
So we're in the east of China, so Shihu, which means West Lake, is a region just on the outskirts of Hangzhou city, which is in Zhejiang province. I mean, Ed and both, well, actually with Jing and Fortnum's, we tend to source our Long Jings from slightly further out in the higher altitude in the mountains, where you have a lot more well, the air is much purer, much cleaner. So yes, I mean, if you go into Hangzhou itself, you'll find it's a real honeypot of activity, and you'll find all sorts of people around there. But as you go out of the city and up into the hills, into the villages, that's where you'll find the smaller makers producing it on a very much on a family scale.
Would you say there's a certain time of year that you would say is the time to buy your Dragon Well?
Spring. Yeah, I mean, traditionally the teas that are produced just before Qingming festival, so it's known as Mingqian teas. So Qingming is around, I think it was the 4th of April this year. So teas made just before then. But yes, the spring, you want that real the early growth, where the tea's been dormant over the winter, it's been storing all of that energy, and then it flushes in the spring, and that's when you get the most incredible flavors coming through.
Question for you, Ed. Planting areas that are producing leaf for Dragon Well, is there a sort of specific denomination where it can come from, or can anybody make it?
Yeah, I mean, there is a protected geographical area of indication, which actually covers quite a wide area. So to buy Dragon Well, it needs a particular stamp on it. And I mean, this is a big subject. I would say, a lot of people will say, no, Dragon Well needs to come from around the West Lake. And that would include places like Lions Peak, Meijiawu, and a couple of other places as well. Actually, the area, the PGI area, goes a lot further. A few hours drive out of Hangzhou to places like Chenan, Jianda, Tonglu, Shaoxing, Xinjiang, Shenzhou, and a number of other places as well. And I think that's fine. That's right. And I think, touching on what Ottilie said, is that, and these are some of the issues I think that it's maybe good to be aware of, is that actually the demand for Dragon Well is so incredibly high in China that it's easy to sell. And busloads of tourists will come during spring to come and just buy some Dragon Well and to be around Hangzhou and around the West Lake, which is beautiful. But let's bear in mind that Hangzhou is a huge city, and there is pollution there, of course. And the West Lake really sort of almost on the edge, but very close to even part of the city itself. And what I've seen over the years, even when I first started, was that the Dragon Well produced around the West Lake, although you could find some very good producers, and there's some very small producers there, excellent ones, the issue is the intensity of production. And typically I would see good tea, well made, but the thickness and fullness of the flavor and thickness of the mouthfeel was often lacking. And I would put that down to soil quality and the sort of intensity of production over a long period of time. And I found that by going outside of Hangzhou and still within the PGI sort of area, I could find incredibly biodiverse, rich gardens, soils, areas, and you would see it on the trees themselves, the tea bushes themselves. The buds and new growth leaf would be very thick, and the mouthfeel would be thicker and richer than that which I was seeing around the West Lake. And I think it's important to bear in mind that soil quality and air quality is very, very important for anything that that's being produced and we're consuming. And I would say that plays that to an extent is true of all tea production anywhere in the world, and certainly throughout China and all the areas I've been to in other parts of the world as well.
I think you will also find that other areas of China, so even down in the southwest in Yunnan, you'll find people producing a Long Jing style tea, and it's, you know, they're using that processing method of the pressing to make the flat leaf shape. But I'm calling it a Long Jing or a Dragon Well style, but that, you know, in my view, it does need to come from that region in order to be called Long Jing.
That's going to be down to the soil as well as the cultivars that are used. I mean, I've seen the Dragon Well style tea made with other cultivars. One, for example, Anji Baicha, which I mentioned earlier. It's a bigger leaf, more feathery, far less robust than Jokun, for example. And it produces a nice kind of tea, making it in that way. It's not the best. And they do it experimentally, unlike Yunnan and Anhui and all sort, you know, Fujian. There's Dragon Well style tea being made, looks pretty much like Dragon Well, but those cultivars are important. Jokung, coming originally from, actually that's the name of the village, I think somewhere in Chennam, is where it originated, and it's one that's grown by not as what would be called a clonal, which is just meaning through cutting. It's a clone because you've taken it off one tree and therefore it's going to be genetically the same through cutting, but grown from seed and selected from the general growing in that area. So tea bushes that have happened to thrive in a particular area because they work with the local conditions. And so I would say Dragon Well needs to be produced by that cultivar, Jiaokong, or there's the newer one from the 80s, Long Jing 43, which is a nice style. It produces a very nice looking Dragon Well, but I think it's far less, not far less. Let me say that again. I think it's, in my experience, less full in flavor and in qualities in general than the Jiaokong that I've drunk. So we normally buy Jiaokong actually.
Well, there's the Chun tea, which is the old tree varietal as well. But again, I mean, this all relates back to the terroir that we were mentioning earlier, and it's exactly the same as wine. Where the tea is grown, its elevation, the aspect, whether it's north, southwest, east facing, the rainfall, all of these things greatly influence the inherent character and flavour in the tea. They say, you know, the standard term is that you can't make good tea out of bad leaves. You have to have the raw material has to be superb quality in order to then then you take the time to process something and create something really, really special.
I guess there's another analogy that picking up on what Ed was saying earlier, that the level of toastiness in the Long Jing is also not a million miles away from the sort of the toasting of the barrel and the influence on barrel sort of vanilla characters that come into some of the white wines and some of the red wines that you might see that have been put in barrel for a period of time. Ottilie, can you demystify for people who are discovering Dragon Well for the first time how we Romanize Chinese and how that gives us slightly different pronunciations when we look at it on in text, or we pronounce?
I can. So I guess a very, very sort of simple crib sheet is the difference between Beijing and Peking. So Peking is the old style of Romanization, and it was called Wade Giles. And then we've moved across more recently. Oh gosh, don't know when. When did we start with Pinyin? I can't remember. But so Beijing and Peking mean exactly the same if you look at the characters, the Chinese characters. But it's just how we Romanize it, how we write it. And so we have exactly the same thing with Long Jing. Long is dragon, Jing as well. And so I think it's Long Qing is the old Wade Giles. Long Qing is the Peking version of Long Jing, which is Beijing. That makes sense.
Makes perfect sense.
I think Pinyin is the way to go. It's actually much easier. It's much easier to get to how it's pronounced in Chinese. and
Yes.
it's much more simple, and it's the standard. So I think we can dump, if possible, Long Jing, which is where you get to, and use Long Jing instead. It's much better, I think.
Ottilie, do you think you can describe for us the differences between how we in the West would brew our tea and then how the Chinese would brew their tea?
So I suppose if we sort of step back a little bit, and that tea drinking is so ingrained in Chinese culture. It's as Sharon mentioned at the beginning, it's an ancient tradition. It's linked to Chinese traditional medicine, so people will be drinking different teas for different healing properties. If we're looking at Long Jing or green tea specifically, there is this sort of traditional way of brewing the gongfu way. It's more communal. I think people will gather around and drink tea, take tea together. It's a very social activity. I think perhaps in the UK we tend to have a cup of tea sort of on our own as a sort of nurturing thing. But Chinese is much more social. We brew in much bigger mugs, whereas in China you will have much smaller vessels to drink your tea from, and we're using much bigger pots or even mugs. In China you will have a much smaller pot, and you will sometimes frequently you'll throw away the first brewing or the first liquoring, and then rebrew, and you can brew the same leaf several times. In fact, I think a lot of people would much prefer the second or the third infusion, particularly on a green tea, because each time you brew it, you bring out different characters. It tends to become more softer, more gentle as the more times you brew it. Everybody will have a little bit, and then more water will be added, and then everybody will have a little bit more again. So I'm not sure if that's explained it sufficiently.
It really does. It explains it brilliantly, because it's also quite seductive that you can buy these fantastic Chinese teas and get to enjoy them properly by brewing them multiple times and enjoying the nuance and the evolution of the flavors that come. So you get more bang for your buck as well. Whilst we can brew them over here if in our own way if we wanted, most of these teas have been created really with the Chinese consumer in mind.
Yes, I suppose that's correct, because I mean, China is as you mentioned before, produces 44% of the world's production. Most of that's consumed domestically. They're only exporting a small amount of what they're making in China. So yes, it is very much for their own consumption, definitely.
And for the absolute novice, how long would you brew your Long Jing tea for?
I hate rules. I hate rules on teas. I just think it's whatever you like. Experiment, try it. I mean, people would say anything. I mean, some people would only brew for 2-3 minutes. Some people say, oh, it needs 5 minutes to brew. Depends what you like. Experiment.
Because the taste will change over that time.
Absolutely.
So yeah, as you say, experiment.
One of the lovely things about China is that not every single tea, but every region has a different tea and a different style of tea making. For oolong and black teas, a small teapot, or a gaiwan, multiple infusions. Typically in around Westlake, the tea is drunk in a glass actually, and the tea leaves are just thrown in a glass and water is added. And they sometimes add a little bit of water and then let the leaves absorb that water and sink a little bit and then add more. So a tall glass is one way to do it if you don't mind getting the tea leaves in your mouth. For us in the West, we might not like that so much. So some sort of small infuser is always a good way to go. And I think I totally agree with Ottilie that it's good to experiment and find the way you like it. But for people that really don't know and this is new to them, and they've spent, you know, a reasonable amount of money on some lovely new tea. They want to get it right. I would suggest try and make it in a teapot that matches your cup size. So if you're going to drink it out of a mug, that's about 250 ml. Don't make more than that, because the flavors will get diffused and it's harder to control. And then when you pour it out, you'll leave some to stew, and that will not taste so good. So I'd use a teapot that matches the cup you're going to make, that you're going to drink it, the tea out of. And for 250 ml, which is about a mug size, I'd use around 3 or 4 grams, 3-minute infusion, and try and use 80-degree water, something less than boiling. So if you want, you could just add a bit of cold water, an inch and a half, onto the leaves, and then pour over boiling. That way the leaves won't be sort of ruined with too hot water, although you can use boiling water, and lots of people in China do. With green tea, the first infusion, drink that. Certainly don't throw it away. It's a mistake to do that. And in fact, for most Chinese teas, don't discard the first infusion. Really, that's for pu'er tea and some oolongs, when it just tastes better when you do that. But generally for tea, this concept of discarding the first infusion, using that in a sort of blanket way, is certainly a mistake. And for Dragon Well, often the first infusion, many people find that to be the best.
Okay. It's probably worth adding as well, always use freshly drawn water, because if you reboil it, it deoxygenates as it's boiling, and you need that oxygen to really bring out the flavors of the tea. The other thing on first, second, third infusions, caffeine's water soluble, so you'll find that that first infusion, you'll have the highest amount of caffeine, and then as you drink more and more, there's less and less caffeine coming out of the leaf. I mean, the per capita, although China's consumption of tea is huge, the per capita consumption is actually much lower, because you'll find a lot of people will have a thermos or a large jar, which they'll keep the same leaf all day, and they'll just keep topping up with hot water. So they're just drinking the same leaf all through the day. I found it extraordinary when first in China many years ago, and all the taxi drivers they were Nescafe jars and they would just be swinging away off the rear view mirror, and that's what they would drink. Just drink that constantly. They have a thermos sitting next to them, and then they just keep topping up hot water all day long. And I think that's really is the best way to drink tea. And to Ed's point as well, drinking it from a glass, you need those calloused hands, because when you have a hot glass of tea, it's like you know you can't drink it until you can actually touch the glass itself.
Yeah. And just to pick up on that, when I also visited China, there were hot boiling water taps available publicly everywhere, and I think yeah, which is fantastic. And I think, you know, we really need to think about or rethink tea on the go here in the UK, and perhaps the availability of hot water would change the types of tea that people would try.
Yeah, I mean, in China, it certainly used to be the idea of drinking something cold or even eating cold stuff. It seemed to damage your digestive energy. Funnily enough, sports people have found that consuming warm or at least not cold food and beverage is actually helpful. And I've certainly, in my experience, that's certainly true. And if I'm not drinking tea, I'll drink hot water. I almost never drink cold water now. I got so used to it. One thing Ottilie said was about the quality of the water, and this is an absolutely essential point. I think if you're drinking nice tea, or even really ordinary tea, even instant coffee, you will see an enormous difference in the quality of the flavor if you use better water. And if you're not lucky enough to live in somewhere where great water, great soft water is coming through your tap, which isn't tainted with chlorine and other things, then to use a softener and a filter, though that product can be got quite easily. A Brita, for instance, is a softener and a filter, both. And there are many other products as well. It makes such a difference to the flavor of your hot beverages, and especially tea. So I would really recommend that every time.
So Dragon Well's typically sold as a loose tea. Are there any other benefits to that?
Well, loose tea, my understanding is a lot of people in this country think loose tea is difficult and a faff. And that's borne out by the vast majority, well over 90% of consumers are drinking tea in bags, tea bags. I think that perception, you know, what Ottilie mentioned about the taxi driver and their jar of tea leaves that they keep topping up throughout the day, shows how easy it is, actually. And I think it can be incredibly simple, just as making coffee in a cafetiere has become, you know, hugely widely adopted and seen as very simple. And so I think that there are a lot of benefits of loose tea, and they answer a lot of consumers' desires. For example, loose tea can be more sustainable. There's less packaging often involved and less packing late, and therefore it creates some efficiencies. It also gives you a much bigger world to explore of authentic origin-driven teas that have come from a place with history and culture, and you can get the taste of a place more easily. Some of those teas are certainly available in tea bag, which is great, but I think you'll get a better range that you have access to if you're able to enjoy loose tea as well. And so, you know, I think people try it, have a go, and you may find that it opens up a new world for you, and it's much easier than you expected.
Well, thank you, Ed. I think that's a perfect way to end today's podcast. Thank you so much to our guests, Ed and Ottilie, and my co-hosts, Will Battle. This has been the first episode of Around the World in 80 Teas, the first few stops, and we hope you'll join us for the future episodes. Thank you.